Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to discuss and explore a topic that is clearly not relevant in the least. We appreciate your coming back to the Center for Presidential History. My name is Jeffrey Engel. I have the honor of being the director, and this is our third rail series for this fall. Those who may not be familiar, third rail series means we're tackling the biggest issues in politics, the ones you're not supposed to talk about, whether even in public whatsoever. And we want to show that it can be done politely and civilly. And I'm confident that most of the people on this panel are capable of civil discussion. 80%. Okay. So my goal tonight, to be fair, is for everyone to be somewhat disappointed. Why? Because, as you see, we have a very large panel, and we do not have a very large amount of time. So I'm going to do away with most of the normal rigmarole of an introduction and kick us right off. I've asked each of our panelists to speak for about 5 minutes, actually precisely 5 minutes, and we will be rigid with that again, for 5 minutes to outline the major point of the long paper, a long chapter that they have contributed for the edited collection, which our center is going to publish in the next year. Tomorrow we're workshopping these, so tonight is the public airing of grievances. So please, if you will, stick to 5 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A, which is, of course, the part that we all like the best. So, without further ado, we are going to go in a non-random order, believe it or not. Our first speaker tonight is Heather Carlquist Walser. I knew I was going to screw that up. Who's a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Presidential History. She is working on a project titled Negotiating Peace and Power, Amnesty in the 19th Century United States, which examines how the government and public used amnesty as a tool to resolve violent political conflicts about the Constitution throughout the 19th century, including the wake of the American Civil War. And Heather has the honor of going first, primarily, I think, because she is one of the two, I guess we can't say fathers of this project, parents of this project. She and Dan Margolis, who will go next, are the editors of the book and really the brainchilds behind this operation. So I'm thrilled that we have not only the opportunity to have Heather kick us off, give us a broad understanding of what we're doing, but somewhere in this room, she hasn't pointed out yet, somewhere in this room is Heather's mom. Hey, how you doing? So everyone, direct your attention that way. Heather, floor is yours.
Is it on? Okay. So just real briefly, the premise of this was kind of rooted originally. The brainstorm came in September last year, which was before the election. So the project has kind of shifted as things have shifted within the world, but the basic premise of that was understanding the core constitutional powers of the president. And this came from the Trump v. United States case. They decided presidential immunity. And it decided, right, that presidents have immunity in their core constitutional powers. And I thought, okay, well, then we need to understand what core constitutional powers are. So everybody on the panel is going to speak about a constitutional power and help us understand what the limits or the lack, perhaps, of limits on those powers are. And I have the pleasure of being able to speak about the power to grant pardons and reprieves, except in cases of impeachment. I appreciate the Snickers. I'm going to talk about it mostly in the context of the American Civil War, which is the most expansive use of the pardon power in American history, when Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson pardoned arguably millions of former Confederates in that moment. And coming out of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the pardon power in 1871 was determined by the United States Supreme Court that it was solely the power of the president and it could not be limited or constrained by Congress. And that's the legal precedent. That's the story that we tell about the pardon power. But in my research, constitutional politics actually tell a very different story, in which during the 1860s and 70s, Congress attempted multiple efforts to both expand and constrain the pardon power. Some were successful and some were not. And the successful ones are actually forgotten. and overruled by what we have decided in Klein that it can't be restricted. But so I just want to talk a little bit about the one successful restriction on the pardon power. And it can be found in the 14th Amendment, not the famous birthright citizenship clause, which is also up for debate. But in Section 3, which gained a little bit of traction a year ago, the insurrection clause, which is that people that had been disloyal to the United States could not hold certain offices. Famously, this within the last few years, right? This is the efforts to disqualify Trump from running for office a second time. Until about a year ago, is oft forgotten and an obsolete clause of the 14th Amendment, but if you read it, it's actually a clear check on the pardon power because it restricted people that had, even if they had received pardons, from holding congressional office until Congress granted them a reprieve from that. So the lesson from the constitutional politics of the 14th Amendment, not from the legal precedent of Klein, is that a strong Congress and public sentiment in opposition can actually check the kingliest of powers that is given in the Constitution.
Wow, I'm impressed. You under time. My God, this is unprecedented. No, you do not. This is unprecedented. You know, this is actually one of the problems of the current era that we're in for presidential politics. Is it requires historians to come up with so many synonyms for unprecedented. So I'm glad that you gave us that. Our next speaker, and again, one of the co-editors of the book, is Dan Margolis, who is the director of, you know what, okay, I'm old. Who is director of strategic initiatives at the University of North Carolina Hussman School of Journalism and Media. He is trained as a historian and has expertise on the history of U.S. foreign relations with an emphasis on legal spatiality, but has also published on a variety of historical, legal, and musical topics. Dan's most recent book is the first full study of COVID-related music, titled something in Spanish, Mapping Latin American Musical Responses to the Pandemic Moment. Most important of all, Dan's greatest claim to fame is that he and I were teaching assistants together for Tom McCormick in 1997. Top that.
All right, and my mom is not here either. But she would like to be. She is very political. So I'm talking. It's an honor to be here, and I'm going to speak quickly, but clearly about emergency power, and also about putative emergency declarations. And I'm also interested in the way that these tie into continuities of power and abuses of power in presidential regimes over time. And so what I really want to stress is those continuities are that the emergency declarations are universally corrosive on the rule of law and on liberty. And to paraphrase Randolph Bourne, who's someone who is a favorite of historians of foreign relations, emergencies are the health of the presidency, which means that they're a powerful stimulant, a dose of a stimulant for claims of presidential power. And it's important to note, emergency is not mentioned in the Constitution, neither the word nor the concept, so it is not a core constitutional power. It's obliquely there in relation to war and treason and insurrection and other emergency-like things. But the concept of emergency is a concept that's been developed by Congress to respond to rapidly perceived crises. And as Heather was speaking, I was thinking of an example of that would be the emergency of the rebellion of the southern states, where the emergency led Lincoln to suspend habeas corpus. So Congress then has created guidelines for emergency, most recently in the 70s, and something called IEPA, which is the International, I had to write it down so I remember, Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is really kind of a toothless authority. It grants the president the power to claim an emergency, but then the toothless part is that Congress has basically abdicated its responsibility after a year to claw back that emergency. So it allows for these claims of expansive emergency power, which, as I write about in the article, is it creates sort of a wormhole of presidential power in which constitutional constraints and the separation of powers and enumerated freedoms and the basic rule of law are all put at risk in support of an emergency which is declared but has no end or possibly no way to create an end. The theorists who write about this kind of stuff, they call it creating the state of exception, which is a state of being in which law has no traction for the sovereign. So you have executive action, which gets unmoored by law in spaces where there is not a law. So it's an exception to the law. And the state of exception that I wrote about in particular was created by George W. Bush after 9/11, and then followed and expanded by Barack Obama in his 2 terms, where we get regimes of extraterritorial abduction, that is, kidnapping people from abroad and bringing them to another site, which were called black sites, which themselves were states of exception in which there was no law, including laws preventing things like illegal torture and detention without trial and other abuses of law. In states of exception in places like Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, which was a prison in Iraq that you're probably familiar with the images from, and also extraterritorial killing of people around the world, including American citizens who were killed without trial by Barack Obama, and less well known by Bush, but expanded and done in flamboyant fashion by Obama. So killing without due process of law, which is also called murder. So the result of this final erosion of the Constitution under emergency is the point where we are now with the Trump presidency, which I don't write about, but with as worth mentioning, because we are fully in the state of exception, with masked, unidentified agents kidnapping people on the street, both citizens and non-citizens, and then rendering them to spaces that there is no law, including camps in El Salvador and elsewhere. And that was my next point, killing Venezuelans in the ocean, fishermen, at least 60 of them so far in spaces outside the United States, again, without reference to law. So I will close quickly, I think under 5, that the state of exception, which is created by the emergency and declarations of emergency, is really the end of a constitutional republic.
Thank you, and I'm impressed that you did that without referencing Madison's famous article in the Federalist Papers about drone warfare. Our next speaker is Jack Rakov, who is the co-professor of history and American studies, as well as a political science and a law professor at Stanford University. His research has focused on the origins of the American Revolution and Constitution, the political practice and theory of James Madison, aforementioned, and the role of historical knowledge in constitutional litigation. He has authored several books, including the Pulitzer Prize and history-winning Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, and he is also a past president of the Society of Historians of Early American Republic. Sir.
Thank you. Thanks very much. My actual contribution to this volume is going to be a paper that focuses on the appointment power of the presidency. The subject should be of great interest to all of us because of the way in which it's being used and misused and abused by the current occupant of the White House. The idea here being that since every member of the executive branch falls under his administrative aegis and he has the authority either to hire or to fire them, almost as a matter of pleasure. And I have a lot to say about that.
Jack, could you pull the microphone
Sure.
a little closer?
I have a lot to say about it in the paper, but I think I'd rather, since I usually bat lead off, at least chronologically in events like this, I'm basically a 1770s and 1780s guy, though I do have some latter-day interest. I think I'd rather, spend my 4.5 minutes or so discussing some just fundamental propositions about the creation of the presidency in the 1770s and 1780s. First proposition is that all of us should appreciate that this was the most novel institution that the framers of the Constitution created. There was no precedent in 18th century political or constitutional practice for the idea of having a national Republican monarch. The dominant forms of executive power in the 18th century were either monarchical or ministerial in nature, ministerial in the sense of the government of Great Britain, and the Americans had effectively rejected both. But the question of how you would constitute a national Republican executive was a great puzzle. It's a much more complicated question than the origins of judicial review, which would usually preoccupies constitutional lawyers. It's actually a fairly simple matter to explain. The second extension of this is that the framers were wrestling with this problem down to the very end of their deliberations. In Madison's famous phrase of Madison, who I often describe as my alter ego, which in some sense is almost true, but not literally. Madison described the presidency as being the subject of tedious and reiterated discussions, meaning the framers went round and round on the subject. Most of the critical decisions that shaped the modern presidency as it takes shape in the Constitution were actually proposed by the most obscure committee that the framers had, the so-called Committee on Postponed Parts, chaired by the very obscure delegate David Brearley, not a household name in the 18th century, much less today, from New Jersey. It came up with most of the critical provisions. It's the one that finally proposed the Electoral College. It's the one that invented the vice presidency, which is a last-minute addition to the Constitution. And a trick question here to ask all of you, of what department is the vice president a member? It also transferred the authority to conduct impeachment trials to the Supreme Court, to the Senate, and so on and so on. And we know very little about its deliberations. It also produced the final version of the vesting clause of Article 2. It says the executive power shall be vested in, well, no, excuse me, the penultimate version of the vesting clause, which figures prominently in all contemporary litigation. It says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. The number of inferences drawn from that single sentence, unwarranted inferences drawn from that single sentence, boggles the mind, whether historical or constitutional or political. So these are all issues that I want to discuss, but the one point I think I really want to stress, it's echoed in many ways in Nikki Hemmer's paper, which we'll hear about shortly, is I want to make a quick comment on Trump versus U.S., the presidential immunity decision, and the way in which it relates to the 18th century discussions. If you have if you vest the executive power in a single person, the conventional, the more familiar defense that's made, and the defense upon which Chief Justice John Roberts relied in the Trump versus U.S. decision, was that the real rationale for having a unitary presidency are the advantages you get by having a single decision maker. And you know, the buzzwords we use here are energy, vigor. Energy and vigor, I think, are synonymous. Secrecy and dispatch. These are all the advantages that a single decision maker can have, whereas if you have a more complicated decision-making mechanism with multiple parties, if you have some form of a plural executive, like a ministerial government would represent, then it gets much more, since I'm in Texas, it falls much more on the muy complicado side of the equation. So Roberts relied on that formula, on that language extensively in Trump versus U.S., in the presidential immunity case. And the great embarrassment intellectually and politically and constitutionally, the great defect and default in that opinion is it neglects one last variable, which actually was the independent variable that dominated the framers' thinking on the subject. And that's the idea of responsibility. Secrecy, energy, vigor, dispatch, those are things a president may mobilize on particular occasions, as circumstances and situation may warrant. Responsibility is a universal obligation. It applies at all times, in all matters. And how do we define presidential responsibility? The chief responsibility the president has is defined in Article 2. It's, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. There's a different version that actually Nikki and I were talking about. A different version of this is responsibility is, in fact, complementary with accountability. The way I would put it is responsibility means that, what are the president's obligations of the Constitution and the laws of the United States? Accountability means who holds him accountable. You might say, in the first instance, Congress holds him accountable via various mechanisms culminating in the impeachment clauses. We, the people, hold him accountable through the electoral process. And one of the great disgraces of Trump versus U.S. was that, Chief Justice Roberts is famous for his balls and strikes metaphors from his confirmation hearings. In the speech they have coming out called Trumped Up Presidential Immunity, I argue actually it's the wrong metaphor. I was the sports editor of the Haverford News back in the late 1960s. What he actually ran was the four corners offense, which the younger people present may not know anything about, but looking out at this audience, most of you who follow hoops as I do remember the heyday of the four corner offense when you try to run out the clock. That's exactly what the Trump court, that's exactly what the Roberts court did in Trump versus U.S. It ran out the clock So the American people would not know conclusively whether or not, well, actually, we did know for all intents and purposes, but we didn't have formal proof of it, whether Trump was guilty of the crimes alleged against him. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Our next speaker is Nicole Hemmer, who is an associate professor of history and director of the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Center for the American Presidency at the football powerhouse known as Vanderbilt University. She is a political historian specializing in the media, conservatism, and the presidency. Her scholarship and teaching focus on the interplay of social movements, electoral politics, and political culture to probe the complexities of political identity and practice in the 20th century United States. Her latest book, Partisans, The Conservative Revolutionaries Who Remade American Politics in the 1990s, is a bold, who wrote this? Is a bold interpretation of your editor did, okay, got it. Is a bold interpretation of the Reagan presidency and the conservative movement. It is bold, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much. The constraint on the presidency that I'm going to talk about is very germane to Trump v. US, and that is the constraint of the law. One of the core ideas of a republic is that no person is above the law. It's what separates a republic from a monarchy or an authoritarian regime. And in the United States, there is one particular moment that people think of when they think of the law constraining the presidency, and that is Watergate. That you have a president engaged in illegal actions, and there are all these mechanisms that snap into place. His aides go to prison, he is facing impeachment, there are hearings, he's ultimately forced to resign. And this is a pivotal moment in the history of the presidency, and a pivotal moment in how we think about presidential accountability for abuses of power. We have a script that we inherit from Watergate about what abuses of power look like, how presidents are held accountable. And in the period after Watergate, or even leading up to Nixon's resignation, there is a response from Congress. Congress sees these abuses of power. They pass the War Power Resolution in order to assert more power over the Vietnam War. And then after the resignation, there are ethics reforms. There's a strengthening of the Freedom of Information Act. The Independent Counsel is put into place. There are all of these restrictions put on the presidency to constrain and prevent abuses of power. And that's the story, the lesson that we learned, right? It's a great morality play. A president abuses power, is forced out of office, and the new accountability mechanisms are put in place to prevent that abuse from happening in the future. And while all of this accountability is taking place, Richard Nixon sits down for his first lengthy interview with a British journalist named David Frost. It's in 1977, and the very famous moment that comes out of that is Frost asking Nixon about illegal acts in office, and Nixon responding, well, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And at the time, people were outraged and they were shocked and they were like, this proves that we were right to force him out of office because he thinks of the presidency as a king would. He thinks about power that way. And then here we are 50 years later, and he was kind of right. At least that's where the Supreme Court ends up. The Supreme Court ends up siding with Nixon on this. And what my project is about and what my paper is about is the fact that if we go back and we look at Watergate, there are two projects that emerge in the aftermath of Watergate to prevent another Watergate from happening. One is the one that I just told you about, a movement to prevent a repeat of Nixon's corruption. But there was a second movement too, and that was a movement to prevent a repeat of Nixon's removal. A way of safeguarding presidents, particularly Republican presidents, from accountability for abuses of power. The war on accountability was a war on the limits to presidential power, and it takes place almost immediately after Nixon resigns. There's very little time between when Nixon resigns and when there is this project to prevent presidents from being held accountable in the future. And in fact, in the 1980s, so we're talking less than a decade after Nixon's resignation, already you're seeing the pieces be put into place to prevent a future resignation. One of these is the issue of presidential immunity. In 1982, the Supreme Court hears a case called Nixon v. Fitzgerald. If you want in the Q&A, I can tell you why they should have never taken the case to begin with, but they take the case and they hand down a decision that invents a new doctrine of presidential immunity. Now, in Nixon v. Fitzgerald, this was about civil suits. It says that presidents can't be sued civilly for their actions in office. It would be too much of a constraint and a distraction for the president. And besides, there were all these other ways of keeping presidents in line. Presidents would worry about re-election. They would worry about their legacy. Congress would hold them to account. It was fine. You didn't need the law to hold the president accountable. So that happens in 1982. In the early 1980s, members of the Reagan administration are developing a new legal theory called unitary executive theory. This is something that Jack was obliquely referencing. This idea that the president controls everything in the executive. He can fire who he wants, he can set policies, he can ignore laws, he can do whatever he wants, basically. Ed Meese, who was the Attorney General from 1984 to 1987, really tried to put unitary executive theory in place as kind of the new legal regime of the Reagan administration. And then the final point I'll make in my last 20 seconds is Iran-Contra. Unfolds publicly in 1986, 1987, and it is a abuse of power on the scale of Watergate. But at the end of the day, the people who are convicted end up having their convictions overturned, or they get a presidential pardon. So you have a lengthy investigation, you have all of the exposure of presidential and executive wrongdoing, but at the end of the day, there isn't accountability. So we should have known in the 1980s what lay ahead, but now that we're here, we should look back and figure out how it happened.
Thank you. You know, we've already heard several allusions to the Supreme Court's recent decision in Trump v. United States, which grants the president full immunity. I do have to say, in defense of the court's majority, they didn't actually read the Constitution. So, our next speaker is Sarah Burns, who is a fellow at the Quincy Institute and an associate professor of political science at the Rochester Institute of Technology. She has written extensively on war powers, American foreign policy, democratic peace theory, elections, and Montesquieu's constitutionalism. Her book, The Politics of War Powers, discusses how the Constitution intentionally puts the president and legislature at odds over control of military affairs.
Thank you. Okay. Watch it unopened. Oh, no. Sorry, guys, 1 second. This is what you do when you have a political scientist in the room with a bunch of historians. So I just want to say thanks again for letting me be a political science interloper. My interest in war powers originally started because when I was in grad school, Obama just decided to send a whole bunch of military infantry over to Libya, and he was like, we're just going to get rid of this guy. And I thought, this is peculiar. Shouldn't there be some limits on presidency? And so in my first book, I try and trace how it is that happened and how we got to such an expansive unilateral presidency and such a supine Congress. And one of the pivot moments, to keep on going with pivot moments, is when we look at the early 20th century. So my paper in this edited volume looks at the presidencies of Wilson, FDR, and Truman. Because in Wilson's presidency, one of the things we see is we still have Congress really standing up to the presidency. So two things that I'll mention about that period is Wilson was actually extremely restrained when it came to the beginning of World War I. He and Congress worked together in tandem to say, we are going to stay out of this. And in part, he had an interest in being a peacemaker. He really wanted that job, but it was really because he was working in tandem with Congress. By the end of World War I, however, we see him go to Paris and say, all right, we're going to work with these other great powers because we're a great power, and we're going to bring this back, and we're going to have peace in the land, and there's going to be democracy everywhere. Everything's going to be great. So he works with all these other powers, comes back to the Senate, and says to them, here's this fait accompli, right? We're going to have the League of Nations, just sign it. And they said, Mr. President, we actually have some powers that we would like to keep, and one of those powers is the ability to decide when and where the U.S. declares war. So when and where the U.S. uses its military. And Wilson, in his obstinacy, says back to them, no, just do what I say. It doesn't matter that the League of Nations can make the U.S. go into war. And the Senate not only says no once, but they reintroduce it and say no twice. So you really see a strong Congress standing up to the presidency at the end of World War I. When we get into Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, a lot of people have opinions about him, so I'm not going to go into a lot of opinions since I only have 5 minutes. But I did want to mention a couple of things. So first, he was not restrained when it came to World War II. He desperately wanted to get into the fight, and he was doing all sorts of things to try and help the Allies as much as possible. Going against laws that Congress passed, passing executive agreements that are absolutely unconstitutional, and he was doing all of this to try and get into the war. Congress kept pushing back against him, however, with the Neutrality Proclamation, or Neutrality Acts, and say, you just can't get into this. We're not going to let you do this. So finally, then, we get to a moment where I would call it a pivot point, just to use Nikki's language, where we see the attack on Pearl Harbor, the attack on Hawaii, the attack on the Philippines, flips Congress on its head. And this is something is arguably constitutionally good in a time of war, that you want to have the presidential powers expand. What you want after that war is for the presidential powers to contract again. What we don't see after World War II, however, is a contraction of presidential powers. Instead, unlike the League of Nations, after World War II, members of the Senate, if you read these documents, they're just like, it's fine, it's just a defensive measure, we will never get into a war. Next year after that, 1949, they also passed NATO, which is definitely not defensive. It is literally offensive against the Soviet Union. And then, 1 year later, I don't know how much time I have left, just getting excited about it. 1 year later, we have the launch of the Korean War. And he didn't call it a Korean War, he called it a police action. Because what he did is he went to the UN, and at the time, the Soviet member of the UN was not seated because he thought, you guys are not being reasonable when it comes to China. So he was out of there. And the only reason they could pass the police action to go into Korea is because the Soviets were not sitting in the UN Council. So then, Truman goes back to Congress and says, all right, guys, we need some money because we have to fund all these boys that we just sent over there. And Congress says, listen, we don't want to be responsible for this, but we will give you money. So let's all be quiet about what we're doing, and you can do that and hold the responsibility. So essentially, the Korean War is when Congress said to the presidency, not my circus, not my monkeys, and just allowed him after that to carry on in however way he wanted to conduct foreign policy. And we see constraints getting smaller and smaller and presidential actions getting bigger and bigger over time. And to keep mentioning Trump, it's not getting better now.
That's a great closing line. Thank you. Our next speaker has the single greatest title in the history of academia. He is the Woody Hayes Chair in National Security Studies at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, as well as a professor of history at The Ohio State University. You all know who Woody Hayes was, right? Okay, just checking, or else he'll punch a student. He specializes on the history of the United States' relationship to the rest of the world. Chris has written several books, including Promise and Peril, America at the Dawn of a Global Age, which examines the origins of modern American isolationism and the interplay of isolationism, international engagement, and domestic reform from the late 1890s through the 1940s. Chris?
All right, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. Thanks for coming out and thinking with us about these really important issues. So in the interest of some creative tensions, based on what Jeff just noted, I probably have a very different take from Sarah on how and why presidential power was wielded in the League of Nations, what isolationists meant in that moment, and interventionism. So if you want to ask us about that and tee up some conflict, go for it. All right, my mandate is to talk about treaty-making powers. If you think anything about executive power in the presidency, Jack deals with this in his chapter, you probably think of Article 2, and the Senate's supposed to do this little thing called what? Ratify treaties. How is it that every single person, no matter how young or old you are in this room, has lived in a time when that almost definitely is not the expectation of what the Senate will do? All of us. How did we get to this point? One thing that's interesting is Congress starts ceding that power right away in the Washington presidency. It starts ebbing away rapidly rapidly because the executives like to negotiate for themselves. They can send out their own diplomats. They can use doctrinal statements to make clear what they really believe, working around any kind of treaty making. You think about signing authorities and signing statements. This kind of stuff has been going on for a long time. But my provocation to you all is that the modernity project of this came with William McKinley between 1898 and 1901. The McKinley presidency, if you don't know much about it, the one thing you probably know about is the Spanish-American War, right, and annexations. What you probably don't think about, and most scholars who study this don't think about, well, how did the U.S. actually annex those areas in the Paris Peace, right? This is old school political history, old school diplomatic history. Was there a 2/3 vote in the Senate? I know Tom Knock knows, but I don't know if many other people know. No, there wasn't. What was McKinley's smart move? What did Congress do? Congress was pushing back. There was a rising anti-imperialist league in that moment, and there was a lot of sentiment that wondered about whether or not the U.S. should hold those territories. Would the people there become citizens? There's racism, there's misogyny, there's civilizational logic. There's all kinds of stuff there. I could go on for an hour. But what McKinley does that's brilliant and sets a modern presidential precedent is he goes for a joint resolution of Congress. So he says, okay, we're not going to send this treaty to the Senate. We're going to lower the threshold, 50+1, get this over the bar as a joint resolution. That then sets a precedent for future presidents to start other kinds of machinations and movements. So what I argue in the piece of my chapter that deals with McKinley is that he sets this precedent by joint resolution that then moves forward all kinds of other elements of this, including fiscal policy by joint resolution. How do we wind up with tariffs set by presidents? You know, the long story short, it happens under FDR, but really people like McKinley, the McKinley tariff that our current president loves to talk about, was very invested in a kind of big stick fiscal diplomacy from the office of the executive. The next thing that he pioneered, executive agreements. You've probably heard of the open door notes, Secretary John Hay. What he started to do was do that diplomacy himself as president to then push forward a presidential agenda. You don't need a treaty if you've already set the policy at the executive agreement level. Two heads of state doing that work, or even underneath the surface, as you see in the Coolidge and Harding presidencies, you have private actors doing that work, empowered bankers to go settle debts. And then the third thing that he sets a precedent for that we see in all the papers so far to some extent, or a subtext to them, unilateral military action. McKinley sent 5,000 Marines to stop the Boxer Rebellion as part of a multilateral operation, and guess what? He got no authorization for the use of military force. There was no war declaration in that moment. So what I argue is that really you see at the dawn of the 20th century the modern presidency aborning, and interestingly, as the parameters of that shift through the first third of the century, you wind up with all of the foundations set for what people think is exceptional today by the time of the FDR presidency. By the time that many public scholars, public intellectuals talk about an imperial presidency, it was all already there. The whole toolkit had been established.
Thank you. Well done. Our final speaker is actually a traitor and a turncoat. Jeff Kahn used to be a professor of law at Southern Methodist University. He is now director of the Law and Government program at American University. His work focuses on constitutional law, national security law, Russian law, and human rights, and he is the author of Mrs. Shipley's Ghost, The Right to Travel and Terrorist Washlets, and co-author of National Security Law and the Constitution, now in its 3rd edition. His work on Russian law has been published in various law reviews, as well as peer-reviewed Post-Soviet Affairs, Problems of Post-Communism, Russian Politics, and the Review of Central and European Law. His latest research focuses on the influence of the Council of Europe in Russia, particularly the European Convention on Human Rights. Professor?
Traitor and turncoat. Thank you, Jeff. It's great to be back. We all experienced this week the death of Vice President Dick Cheney, and a quote from the Vice President caught my eye because it struck me that it encapsulates the argument that I'm making in my paper. In January 2002, he had an interview with Cokie Roberts, and he had this to say, among other things. In 34 years, I have repeatedly seen an erosion of the powers and the ability of the President of the United States to do his job. And he And he cited the War Powers Act, he cited the Budget Anti-Impoundment Act, a few other things, and then he went on and he said, and one of the things that I feel an obligation, and I know the President does too, because we talked about it, is to pass on our offices in better shape than we found them to our successors. We are weaker today as an institution because of the unwise compromises that have been made over the last 30, 35 years. We are all experiencing the after effects of that project because the Bush administration used the terrorist attacks of September 11th, a horrible day, to start that rebuilding project. Some of that rebuilding happened, whether you like their policies or not, in a perfectly legitimate and constitutional fashion. The Patriot Act is passed by Congress and signed by the President. In my field of terrorist watch lists, the Aviation and Transportation Security Act creates the TSA in November of 2001. Homeland Security Act folds that into the new Department of Homeland Security in 2002. And this is perfectly normal inter-branch exchange. This is how we want the political branches to function. But they also engaged in other projects. So we now know a little bit more about the warrantless surveillance program that was not passed by Congress. And we know about the black sites and Guantanamo Bay. These are also things that were institutions and aspects of past acts or statutes or executive power passed for completely different purposes and completely different times, and now they're being repurposed. And what my chapter talks about is one of those. So let me put it to you in personal terms. If any of you have flown on a plane in the last 20 years, you had to, when you bought your ticket, provide your name, your birth date, and your sex in the little computer form when you entered your credit card information and bought the ticket. American Airlines didn't care, but that information was sent by them to an entity that you might never have heard of to vet your name against not just a no-fly list, but an ever-increasing number of terrorist watch lists. And if someone in a far-off office, in an undisclosed location, working without name or any sort of identifying information that you would have access to, decided that you were a suspected terrorist, you're not getting on that plane. Now things start to break down. First of all, we don't have the political branches eager to fight against this sort of a program. Think of the moment that we were in after 9/11. It wasn't a growth industry for a politician to take on as a move for constituent services all those suspected terrorists in the district and fight for their rights. So you don't get political branch activity in Congress. The courts are quite deferential to the president when it comes to national security. And it's not too hard to paint this as a foreign threat. So that leaves you at the tender mercies of this unidentified organization. What was it? Well, the no-fly list, you might think, is operated by the Transportation Security Administration, that agency that was passed by bicameralism and presentment through both houses of Congress, signed by the president. They execute the list, but they don't make it. It's made by an organization called the Terrorist Screening Center. And the only reason we know where it's located is because the air conditioning units for its massive computer data banks were so loud and so continuously noisy that it created a zoning problem in the local neighborhood, and it got the zoning board on their case, and it was revealed in a small town paper where this place actually is. But you can't go in. You can't meet anybody there. And if you actually have the moxie and the money to sue for your fundamental right to travel, which everybody from the Supreme Court down asserts that you have, you'll run into a buzzsaw of all sorts of problems. You'll run into old legal structures built for different purposes and different crises that have been repurposed to block your access to the Terrorist Screening Center. Push a little harder, and you might get to the Court of Appeals, which will force the district court to hear your case. But then, citing national security, it will be a Kafkaesque experience for you. Because instead of having the experience in court that you might think, open testimony, live witnesses, evidence that's argued back and forth by both sides, you'll have ex parte structures or ex parte information given just to the court outside of the presence of your attorney, so that the judge can see a little bit, a peek under the curtain of the secret information that's keeping you off of that plane. So my chapter is about the only case to date in the last 20 years that actually got to trial beyond all those tricks and motions and obstructions. And in the course of telling that story, I give one fact at the end, and that is, it's not called the Terrorist Screening Center anymore. Because there's no natural logic that should say, if you're too dangerous to fly, you shouldn't be on some other list preventing you from doing some other thing, like driving a semi-truck or having access to a port. Or we have seen several efforts to create a no-gun list. Because after all, if you're too dangerous to fly, you're surely too dangerous to own a gun. So now it's not the Terrorist Screening Center. It's called the Threat Screening Center, which gives you a sense of how they're overflowing their banks and expanding this work. So to conclude, I'll conclude with a quote from Justice Scalia. I consider this a separation of powers problem. And commenting about a different separation of powers problem, Justice Scalia once said, you know, sometimes these problems, they come kind of in sheep's clothing. And it takes a little bit of effort to figure out just exactly what's going on and how the separation of powers isn't functioning the way it should. But, Justice Scalia said, this wolf comes as a wolf. Thank you.
All right. Well, I look out at this crowd, and I see many people who are probably on the terrorist watch list. But we are nonetheless going to give you the opportunity, sir, yeah, volunteer. We are nonetheless going to give you the opportunity of exercising your free speech rights and asking questions of our group. We are going to put microphones on either side, and put microphones on either side, and I would encourage you to ask your best, but first and most importantly, when you do ask your question, please speak into the mic so it will be recorded with our video system for future reference. So, who's got a question? Sir.
Fantastic panel. This is amazing. My question has to do with the National Guard being deployed in American cities and being federalized, and more specifically, full disclosure, I'm in the Texas Army National Guard, so this is very, very personal for me. Our units being sent to other states, the governor saying we don't want you, don't need you, and they're still being sent to other states, and we're stuck in this legal limbo. Just curious to hear your thoughts on either A, where this is going, or B, is there a system of checks and balances to make sure we don't have a Civil War 2.0?
Well, there's a basic law that was passed during Reconstruction called the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the military forces from being used for policing, but the National Guard gets a separate treatment for that. So it's been, the governor's opinions haven't been, when the governors have gone to court to say they're not interested in having the National Guard troops deployed, especially from one state to the other, that's been determined to be legal, even though they're constrained via posse comitatus. So that I think, personally, well, obviously it's, from my perspective, a massive abuse of power, and it is definitely an enormous problem and a crisis for the country. But when posse comitatus is directly overrun, then it will really be a massive crisis. And an example for emergency power was when when Katrina hit in New Orleans. Bush sought immediately, despite the obvious failures of FEMA to act as supposed to, he tried to deploy the troops there and have Posse Comitatus suspended, and that was prevented. So the troops were there, but they were doing non-policing. So the troops can be in place but not be doing policing activity, which is arrest and other sorts of things, but it doesn't prevent their physical presence, but it does prevent the activity that they do. And so there's precedent for this, especially with real emergencies. Katrina is an example of a real crisis when a city is overrun with water and there's, refugees and so on. So that's my long-winded answer.
This is a classic example of what I'm talking about. You have some statutes like the Posse Comitatus Act and other statutes that are supposed to organize the use of the National Guard for certain purposes. And the problem of a governor not wanting the National Guard to come is a very strange problem to have, because typically those purposes are to help when the governor is finding that his or her own resources are insufficient for the emergency or the problem at hand. And so part of the problem is, and we were talking about this earlier, that statutes aren't enough. You need to have a set of informal norms, principles, ethics, professional responsibilities that dictate to you the obligations, the purposes that the law takes not for granted, but it's hard to put in black and white. Here are all the things you're not supposed to do. We used to police that in informal ways, and I think that we're finding in the current moment just how fragile our institutions and structures are, because they all stand on this assumed foundation of shared responsibility, purpose, conviction, and when you have in office executive officials who only look at the law as what's going to get me into trouble, the so-called Holmesian bad man. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that there's a certain individual who, when looks at the law, he says, what is it that is going to get me into trouble? And that's the constraint. But up until now, we haven't had, at least for such prolonged periods of time, a Holmesian bad man approach to such sweeping areas of law, including the placement of the National Guard.
Anyone else? There is a beautiful irony to seeing the governors of New York and Illinois claim states' rights from the presence of federal troops. We actually have another person right in here, Katie.
This is like finding out that your grandfather was a mass murderer. Is democracy a kabuki?
So the question was, if it feels like finding out that your grandfather was an axe murderer, like, is democracy just a kabuki? Like, have we just been pretending this whole time? And I think that is a question that a lot of people are confronting. Like, if it was all held together by spit and wishes or norms and these informal things, it seemed to kind of work, more or less, until it didn't. So there was something real there. Right? There was a kind of agreement about the way that the system would work, that enough people adhered to, that it worked for enough people to sustain, sometimes interrupted, but for a fairly long period of time. And now we're here, and it doesn't seem like it's sustaining anymore. And it seems like a number of the assumptions that the Constitution was built on, primarily this one that was just being referenced, which is the Constitution was premised on a system in which you had disinterested, public service-minded people who were in public service, and that their concern about their reputation and their commitment to a set of values was what was going to keep the system together and keep it working. And now we're seeing what happens when it turns out that that's not the case.
The idea of good faith has disappeared.
The idea of good faith, he's just said that the idea of good faith has disappeared, and that is also true. And it requires, I think, two things. One, we're in a system that is flooded with bad faith arguments and with bad faith politics, and that's really dispiriting because you want to make good arguments, and you make good arguments, and you're just like flooded with nonsense, and that drives good people out of public service. You see a lot of congressional resignations because people are like, it's not even open. Why are we doing this? Like, I can't govern here. And that's a big problem. I think that as dispiriting as it is, the next step is going to have to be the reconstruction of American democracy. Some big systemic and institutional things are going to have to change. And given that, it is a worthwhile multi-generational project to think about what those institutional reforms look like and how you build a better democracy. Now that we know what we know about human nature, now that we live in this particular media environment and this particular society, what does a good functioning democracy look like? It's probably not the democracy that was constructed by the Constitution, which actually wasn't that interested in democracy, but that's a different conversation. And so how do we build a government for a functioning multiracial democracy? That's our big task.
I'll just chime in here too. I'm not known for like half glass full kind of takes on this, but I think if this panel shows anything, we've been in these spaces before. Like, it feels particularly devastating right now, or scary, or depressing, or like things are bad. But I studied the Civil War, right? Like, literally Civil War. Millions of people died. We have been in scary, questionable places about democracy before. And I'm struck in part, there's a Supreme Court case about Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, which, right? Vast overreach of presidential power, but we love Abraham Lincoln, so like we're okay with it. But there's a justice that offers his dissent in this opinion. It's in the opinion, and he says, if wicked men, like what if wicked men hold these positions? If we allow this to happen, just because we know Abraham Lincoln is a good person, and because it's the Civil War and things are dangerous, that's great, but what if wicked men are in this position? And so it just, right, like we've had these kinds of questions before. We've been in situations where we've wondered, what do we do next? What does democracy look like? Nikki mentioned Reconstruction, right? Like, Reconstruction didn't go great, but there were also 3 really important amendments that came out of Reconstruction. So as much as I want to like wallow in doom and gloom, and I think if you like read the headlines every day, it's very easy to do that, I think historians can also offer the perspective of like, you know, we were here with McKinley in 1900, and like we're still here in 2025. So like we can reconstruct, we can find these spaces, we just have to be willing to do it.
Heather, I couldn't disagree more. I mean, and I am the oldest person. I am the oldest person on this panel. But in any case, we are in a situation without any precedent in American history. I mean, there was a game that which president would you compare Donald Trump to? I think, the one, the leader of the pack seems to be Andrew Jackson. There's no point comparing Trump to Jackson. I mean, Trump is so uniquely malformed in so many, and actually we're having a discussion as to whether he's, psychology, what were we saying before? Whatever words I used at the end of my paper. I mean, that's the greater puzzle, and I think also, well, there are actually 2 aspects of this. One, Trump is unlike any other person who's ever been in a position of power. I try to imagine how historians a century from now, thinking either about the United States or globally, are going to write the history of this period. I'm writing a political history of the Constitution. I've been kind of hung up on it because of Trump, and now I finally worked out where I am. I'm ready to go ahead with it. But I thought of like my colleague David Kennedy, who inherited a great textbook from Tom Bailey. If I had to write a general history of the United States in this period where there's so many aspects of our behavior you have to explain, write a history of the Constitution, and in the end it's not so hard. The problems define themselves. Accounting for the multiple forms of deterioration of norms and institutions, that's an entirely different different ballgame. So I just, it's not a time for drawing lessons from the past when the issues you're dealing with are so novel.
Yeah, I'll briefly add, America's been America is the first democracy. So in 1800, we have the transfer of power from Jefferson to Adams, and it's been messy ever since. So I'll join Heather in being glass half full. Part of the joy of being an academic is wallowing in the horrible parts, because that's how we make our money. So it's important for us to explain these things to you. At the same time, as Heather mentioned, we've been in bad places before and we have reconstructed. So it's messy, it's complicated. Just to add and pile on to, I guess, Britain didn't become a democracy until the late 1800s, right? So we got there first. And we didn't do it great at first, but we keep reinventing it. And so there's a value to be talking about the bad things, but a value to be thinking about all the beneficial and wonderful things about this country, like these events.
And I see skeptical faces down there. Does anybody want to jump in?
If you're inviting us to jump in, sure.
Yes.
I want to take this in another direction, which is the role of expertise in policymaking and executive power. So one of the things that's changed that perplexes me about our current moment, and I think about probably too much, is why Americans, in survey after survey, don't think that politicians, or the office of the president especially, should be subject to expert knowledge and the development of experience over time, right? So if you look at, Jack could probably chronicle this for an hour, all the different kinds of roles that framers and founders envisioned and took on. They're in state legislatures, they're in ministerial things, they stand for election, they sometimes don't, they get appointed, blah, 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 right? But lots of them do public service, and it's not just some altruistic public service ethos, right? They, had all kinds of benefits, and they were plenty racist and misogynist and all kinds of things like that, but they had expertise in running government, right? And the expectation was, and if you think about electors and some of the other stuff, the institutional expectations were that there was a mediating force of expertise and knowledge that would then derive to, or default down to, be distilled down to the most elite positions in American society that were elected or appointed. Where has that gone? Right? You think, so Donald Trump's the only president who never served in any role, never had any public service, any community service. Whatever you think of how great business leaders might be and how terrific they might be for holding all kinds of offices, you have to think that you'd expect some level of expertise in government would translate to better governance, right? We do this when you do foreign relations operations in other countries. One of the main things that American diplomats, Marines, CIA, right, whether it's intelligence, or they're trying to train up other people in other countries to have the necessary experience to govern themselves. No matter what problems you have with that project, that's the idea. We, Americans, don't tend to believe that about our own government. And this is the government that we have today. So is it a kabuki theater? It's partly a kabuki theater because we're letting puppets, we're letting actors play the role, right? We're not actually demanding expertise in office and holding people accountable when they don't perform in that way.
It's not kabuki theater. It's much worse than that. And here's why. As a lawyer, I look at cases that succeed, and it just makes me feel great when a judge demands evidence to support a claim. Evidence that's supported by the federal rules of evidence, demands a certain decorum and process in the courtroom because of the federal rules of civil procedure, demands live witness testimony. I said this before. But that's not the world that the vast majority of our fellow citizens live in. The vast majority of our fellow citizens get their news from sources that have no interest in, no respect for, no self-accepted responsibility to present as truth or a sense of objectivity. So Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but nobody's entitled to their own facts. But we now live in a world where we all feel entitled to our own facts. What's worse, we are living in a world that is so atomized in the United States in terms of socioeconomic class distinctions, a world where the Gini coefficient, which measures the distance between the wealthiest and the poorest in a society, is greater in the United States than in any other modern democracy, by leaps and bounds. So that's our civil space. And it's a civil space where we no longer have clubs and bowling leagues and activities that bring us together. We are isolated and separated. And so I say it's much worse because of a comment that I heard here at SMU maybe about 10 years ago when Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, came and gave a talk. And someone in the audience said, "What keeps you up at night?" And I'm sure that the expected answer was supposed to be nuclear proliferation, chemical weapons, bioweapons, or something like that. Without missing a beat, Brzezinski said, "It's the thought that we're living in such a powerful state with such an uneducated citizenry."
It's hard to follow these guys, but I'll just say I was agreeing with Chris when he was talking originally, because as historians we're trained to think systemically, and I wrote a whole book about how everything that the Bush W did legally had been laid out in the 1880s and the 1890s, actually particularly here on the border in Texas. So if you're interested, I could talk your ear off, but I won't do it here. But this is like, it is not something that I would expect to feel, but I keep coming back to it as we've been talking about this project, which is how much character matters. So I don't feel like democracy, I mean, I think this is a country that has never stood up completely to its ideals. Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder, he raped his slave. He was a reprehensible person in many ways, but he wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is much bigger and better than anything that he did or that the United States has ever done, and it's entered the world and has changed the world in a lot of ways. And so what's mattered over time in a lot of the leadership, which is, again, something that historians are not usually trained to admire, which is character of people. And I'm not alone in saying this now. There are people starting to recognize that when you have someone with no character, as Jack was saying, then you have a system that is designed to be, it's an imperial system that's built on racism, it's built on violence, it's built on expansionism, and it's built on rampant executive authority abusing power, but it's been held in check in a lot of ways by law, but it's also been held in check by people who have had character, and for some reason that I think we all need to interrogate very carefully, the society, it's just vanished in our society and a lot of our leaders, and it's been a crisis as a result. So.
We have a question down here.
So I'm loving this panel, but I'm also worried that I'm getting a little bit too comfortable. And in the spirit of the third rail, I've heard a lot of conversations over the last, 10 years about the importance of character and virtue in the Constitution and, the supine Congress and all of these things. But we also heard, especially from Nikki and also Jeff from you about Cheney, about serious public service-minded individuals who were deeply invested in building the idea of the unitary executive. And they did it, I've made a lot of jokes about Dick Cheney not having a heart in my life. But I believe, right, he wasn't on a machine for a while. Anyway, but I believe he was a sincere and dedicated public servant who believed in the project of the United States. And I also believe that the Bush administration thought it was doing things for legitimate emergency reasons, and that they believed they needed a stronger executive, and that the people who were protecting a subsequent Nixon were doing so because they believed that in the modern world, the presidency needed to be that strong and powerful. So explain to me why.
So explain to you why they believed that the presidency needed to be so strong and powerful. So one of the things is, coming out of the Vietnam War, they believed that the U.S. was too constrained in that moment. That in fact, all of the weaknesses in the United States had come from constraint. Was there a problem with crime? That's because the Supreme Court handcuffed police and kept them from properly holding people accountable. We weren't winning wars because we weren't unleashing the full power of the US military. And we were failing in foreign policy and becoming a weaker country because we didn't have strong enough presidents. And in fact, all of those reforms that we've lauded as a font of accountability, and we're finally like holding people to account for abuses of power, we're seen by people like Cheney as unfair constraints on the presidency. And you see this in a number of places. Cheney writes the Minority Report for Iran-Contra, and he says, the president should have this power. It's foreign policy. You voted for him knowing what his foreign policy was. Congress shouldn't interfere with it. If we want a safer world, a better world, the world that Ronald Reagan promised, you've got to let him do what he wants, even if it violates international law, even if it violates the constraints of the Constitution. There's a higher purpose, right? And it's that idea of a higher purpose, something higher than, they wouldn't put it this way, but like higher than the Constitution, higher than the constraints of law, that there are some things that are more important than that. And that is the idea that is fueling this expansion of Republican presidential power. And you see it again with September 11th, right? Some of the first op-eds that come out are like, we were attacked on September 11th because the Church Committee and the Pike Committee constrained the intelligence communities. And because of those constraints on the intelligence communities, which were for things like attempted assassinations and policing the American people and giving people drugs secretly, like these really terrible abuses of power, they're saying, well, the consequences of that was that 3,000 Americans died on 9/11. And so they see that as a balance that the US got wrong. And it's not just people in power who see it that way. If you look at the letters that are being written in by people at some of these big moments, like when Oliver North goes on trial, they're like, he was an American patriot who was trying to do the right thing. And he deserves grace for that. And he answered to a higher power. And so that's what should carry the day.
So I'd love to address this. So my current book project is on conservatives in the early Cold War and the debate within the Republican Party about what the U.S.'s stance should be in the world. And coming out of the Second World War, figures like Robert Taft, Mr. Republican, senator from Ohio, were taking a radically different stance than even the Dwight Eisenhowers or the moderates like Dewey. And their argument was, like, we normalized some of what you were noting, or in the sense of the third rail, as if conservative politics have been mostly one thing. And that's just flat out wrong. So from the farther right came the most critical stances about U.S. internationalism. Why was there a 9/11? If there had been more Taft people, the U.S. wouldn't have had bases in Saudi Arabia. If there had been more Taftian foreign policies, the U.S. wouldn't have had a Marshall Plan or joined NATO. I'm not saying those are good or bad things. I'm not making a normative judgment. I'm just suggesting that a whole series of processes came through where a kind of moderate interventionist Republican Party that saw the executive and expansion of the executive as a significant and important role in advancing U.S. world leadership on its own terms was very different from what the farther right in the 20th century wanted. What they wanted was truly, they're coming out, most of them were America First sympathizers. They were coming out of a position where they thought the proper role for the U.S. was to demilitarize, mostly after the Second World War, to not build a large military-industrial complex. This is Herbert Hoover, this is Taft, this is Bricker Amendment, 1954. The attempt was to bind the hands of the president so he couldn't do the stuff I was talking about before. Executive agreements, as Sarah talks about, right? Overturning the Neutrality Acts, Lend-Lease, destroyers for bases. So what's informing so many of them, and what's been peculiarly lost in our current moment, is big government conservatism that we live with today that doesn't think about fiscal conservatism, which was the dominant strand in the 40s and 50s of the farther right. What we've lost is a kind of conversation on the farther right about the limits of U.S. power, which used to be there. And go back to this, the Senate rejection of the League of Nations. William Borah and some others, and this is what Nikki's comments bring up for me. William Borah, senator from Idaho, one of the greatest orators in the Senate in U.S. history. He argued consistently for the binding power of something he thought of moral suasion and international law. He was a lawyer. So many of these Republican internationalists who actually wanted the U.S. to have less of a role were lawyers who believed in the international system. Right? It's the opposite of our current era where you have a lot of these folks who want to exploit the international system explicitly for the U.S. Now, it's a slightly more complicated story than that because they didn't want the U.S. citizens to be tried and some other things. But if you step back and you think about what was that higher power that earlier conservatives called out for, it was sort of the binding moral suasion of international law, of peacemaking, and the U.S. having less of a stance in the world that would then subject it to the kinds of things that we've been talking about, create states of exception, create watch lists, right? Do all of this stuff. A more limited U.S. role in the world through commerce and culture was what they were calling for from the 20s through the early 50s. Taft dies in 53, and that wing of the Republican Party is eviscerated as any significant player for, say, the presidency.
We're running out of time, unfortunately. We have time for one more question after I make this comment, because I think my voice matters. I am really disturbed when I look back on the totality of my life and realize how much time I've spent thinking about Dick Cheney. And I think he embodies a central problem. And in fact, perhaps if there was one thing I would castigate him for, were he here, it is the fact that he abrogated his constitutional responsibility as a member of Congress when he advocated for the unilateral executive from the 1970s on. We teach our students in elementary school something terribly, terribly wrong. We tell them that our system is set up for a balance of power. It's set up for a competition of power. It's set up for a struggle of power. So any congressperson who does not fight desperately, Madison would tell us, for the prerogatives of Congress is not doing his or her patriotic duty. The solution to this, I don't know. Maybe term limits. But at the very least, I know that Dick Cheney has a long history as being one of the provocateurs of unilateral executive from his position in the Congress. We have some over here.
Hi, I know this panel has talked on kinetic war power and wartime in the physical sense, but I wanted to hit on economic warfare. I think many would make the case, myself included, that we're in a time of economic warfare in the United States, and I wanted to get the panel's perspective on tariffs. More specifically, Donald Trump exercising unilateral authority to exercise those tariffs specifically. Thanks.
Well, I mean, it's all a matter of perspective, but economic competition is not warfare, even really fierce competition. And even if it was warfare, the Congress would still have the authority to tax Americans. We fought a revolution against taxation without representation, about tariffs, and not only about that, of course, but so yeah, I wouldn't. If things are framed as a war, that's usually the excuse executives have used across time and across all the papers to claim all sorts of powers, because war, is the invitation to emergency, which then is the invitation to executive power abuse. As long as I have the mic on, I want to just say one more thing, which I think links to what Chris was saying very clearly, and I didn't say it, but my paper talks about it a lot, which is, I think the argument about power in particular, all of the people that you were referencing, and Republican presidents and Democrats alike, the thing that they've all embraced since the very founding of the country has been empire. And so empire has linked all of that. So I think actually what makes Trump an anomaly is he's someone who doesn't understand empire and actually doesn't care for it, doesn't understand the benefits that it has given the United States in terms of military hegemony across the world and economic supremacy. So American economic supremacy, including the dollar, is built on American empire, and American empire is something that all of these parties have drawn on, and it's offered a lot of massive expansion of executive authority. There used to be a debate that we were an empire, but now we're not, and now we're, I think, the really ahistorical and interesting if I wasn't alive at this moment, is to watch an empire dismantle itself for no purpose at all except for the leader's whims. And so we'll see what happens when a massive power disappears in the world as a result.
Well, let me exercise leader's whim. Because I promised you all I was going to leave you dissatisfied. I fear that we have exhausted our time tonight. I think we've actually given way more complaints, concerns, one might even say fetching, then we have solutions. So let me offer one solution, an obvious one, which I think is we should all take it upon ourselves, those of you who came out tonight, to support your local historian. And in particular, should you be interested, support the Center for Presidential History. If you're interested, we have, of course, our Article II Society. Remember, the Constitution has Article I is the Constitution, is the Congress. Article II is the executive. And we use those funds to help current and future Mustangs achieve their best careers they can. So I want to take this opportunity to thank my panelists and also to thank you all for coming out tonight in support of democracy.